Okay, so we've got Dr. Munir Elawar with us, and we're going to go ahead and let him introduce the topic, and we're going to have plenty of time for interactive discussion, roundtable discussion on the Grand Rounds of the Internet. N3PQ, this is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, turning the mic over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak in this forum, and welcome to our discussion. And please, by all means, I would like it to be a discussion and ask questions anytime you wish. So our topic today on this fine Sunday morning is the prefrontal lobes. We will talk about that, but first, to orient ourselves, we're going to talk about the brain in general. So we're going to go from the general to the specific. And I'm going to even give a historical perspective. We're going to start with ancient times, with antiquity, because there have been many ideas about the function of the brain over the centuries, starting with the Greeks and even before the Greeks. So I'll mention just a few for interest. So in ancient Egypt, when they discussed personality and function and morality, the brain was pretty much disregarded. Everything was supposed to be in the heart. As you know, the famous mythology is that whenever somebody dies, their heart will be weighed against a feather, and then you can tell whether they're a good person or not a good person. Even Aristotle, who had many, many seminal and important contributions to logic, to philosophy, to natural science, for some reason, he thought the brain was mainly a cooling organ for the heart and for the rest of the body. And I can maybe see why he thought that. I mean, the blood does go up there and get circulated. Now, Galen, in the 2nd century AD, he was doing some dissections, and he kind of figured out, the brain does have a role in sensory processing. To be fair, there were some people before Galen who also thought the brain had something to do with our personality, with our motor function, with the way we talk, the way we walk, etc. And I bet that partly happened because people would get injured in battle, and then you can see the results of the brain injury, what would happen. So that was kind of one way to study brain function, I guess. So in the, I believe, 16th century, if I'm not mistaken, René Descartes, the French philosopher, was very famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." And even before him, Saint Augustine, in the, I forgot which century, I know like the 3rd or the 4th century AD, he said, "I doubt, therefore I am." So there were thoughts about the importance of brain function, not only in our daily life, but in how we understand the world around us back then. Descartes, though, had another very, very interesting idea about how the brain functions. You see, Descartes thought that we have thoughts and we have sensory experiences. So we have mind and we have body. And there was an interaction between mind and body. So it's not that brain produces the mind or produces thinking. There was an interaction between the mind and the body. And he thought the pineal gland was the nexus for the interaction. The pineal gland, as many of you know, is a small gland deep in the brain that has a lot to do with melatonin secretion, with the diurnal cycle, the night-day cycle, and it also has to do with hormonal regulation. Now, I mention these old ideas not to discount them or disparage them. As a matter of fact, I have great, great respect for these people back then who didn't have our techniques, our technologies, that nonetheless were brave enough to try to answer questions about the brain and were curious about how the brain functions. So my hat off to them, that's for sure. So now we do have modern questions and modern views about brain function. One major discussion topic, especially in the 19th century, was whether brain function is diffusely represented or localized to certain parts of the brain. So let's say if we see something or we think about somebody, is the whole brain involved in that, or is it just specific regions of the brain? So it has been shown that some particular functions can be assigned to certain brain regions, like motor function, movement, speech, understanding, vision, can be assigned to certain parts of the brain. On the other hand, these regions are very, very heavily interconnected with many other regions of the brain. So it's certainly much more complex than just, is it localized to one area or is it diffused on the whole brain? Now, researchers have been successful in localizing things like speech, motor function, sensory function, vision, hearing, etc. But the more challenging part was localizing or understanding how the brain affects mental and behavioral functions. And this is going to be the thrust of our discussion today. Examples of things that are somewhat difficult to localize are attention, vigilance, analytic and synthetic thinking, among many others, and we'll talk about that. So where do we stand now, and how did we get from there to here? So it is convenient or traditional to divide the brain into lobes. We have the frontal lobe, which basically is the very front of the brain. We have the parietal lobe, which is just behind that. The occipital lobe is all the way in the back of the brain. The temporal lobe is to the side, kind of under and over the ear. There's a limbic lobe that doesn't show here. It's inside the brain, and we'll talk about that also. So this is a gross division. It has been shown since then that there are many interactions between the various lobes, between the various parts of the brain, and it's not as simple as it looks on the surface. So one thing very important about the brain, for its size, you would think, how much information, how much matter, how many neurons can you pack into that volume, into that mass? Well, the truth is the brain is folded in many, many, many different ways. And so if you actually take that area and spread it out, it's actually quite a big area. And the frontal lobes, which is the area, you can think about it as a gross approximation. If you take a line between the two ears, and anything in front of that line would be the frontal lobe, takes up a big, big portion of the brain, especially in humans, much, much more so than in lower animals, or so-called lower animals. So let's say if you compare a human brain to a chimpanzee brain, to a gorilla brain, orangutan brain, cat brain, etc., you notice several things. First of all, it's larger relative to body size. It's more complex. It has these folds that we call gyri and sulci, which are basically hills and valleys. And it has more folds in a large surface area. If you spread it out, we're talking 1,500 to 2,000 square centimeter, which is like between 230 and 560 square inches. Quite a big area there, surface area, with billions upon billions upon billions of neurons. So there's a difference not only between species, but also as the baby develops, as the fetus develops, let's say from 25 days to 9 months, you can see that the brain was initially smooth. Well, first of all, it was a cord, nothing but a cord. Then you start developing the various parts of the brain, the frontal brain, the back brain. I'm not going to use technical terms, but rhombencephalon and telencephalon and things like that. But as it develops, the lobes start taking shape, but even more importantly, they start to fold into each other, so that in that small volume, relatively small volume, you can have a very large square area and myriad number of neurons, and more importantly, maybe the connections between the neurons. The neurons are the brain cells. So how do we study brain localization? Well, again, I like to take a historical view to understand what we are doing now. So going back in history, let's go to the 18th century. There was a gentleman by the name of Franz Joseph Gall. He pioneered what was called craniology and later developed into phrenology. The idea there was that different brain regions were associated with different mental faculties, with different personality traits. It became popular to feel the bumps on the skull. The idea was if a part of the skull was bumpy, then the area of the brain underneath that bump is more developed. So, for example, if the front was bumpy, then this person is more perceptive or more reflective. If the back is bumpy, that person is more cosmetic. By the way, just looking at my own skull, based on this, I'm very uncosmetic. I can have a flat head in the back. But this became very popular to the extent that it made its way into literature. I'm a big fan of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. And in one of his novellas, The Hound of the Baskervilles, Dr. James Mortimer wanted to check Holmes's skull because Holmes had supposedly very great analytic powers. Now, this was discredited. Later, however, other people took the idea of localization and worked in a more scientific way about how to localize various parts of the brain. Of note at that time were Paul Broca from France and Karl Wernicke from Germany, and they worked a lot, especially on localizing speech function and language function in the brain.
We're going to pause one here for ID. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta with November 3, Papa Quebec.
This is N3PQ, handing it over to the net.
Okay, thank you. Momentarily here, we'll take a little break to take any late check-ins, and then we'll open it up for any questions. Do we have additional check-ins to make your call to Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta?
Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, W1PE does it. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Bobby. W1BEW up in Knoxville at the University of Tennessee. Congratulations on your big win over Alabama yesterday. And glad to have you here with us. Do we have any other check-ins? Go ahead and take a list for any initial questions or comments. And in listening to Munir talking about feeling the head, I'm just curious from our participants here today, how many of you had a family member, a grandmother, a grandfather do that to you? Go ahead and let us know. We'll start a little list of questions and comments from Munir. Go ahead and make your call to Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. I'm not hearing any requests from that. I can't remember specifically if anybody felt my head, but I must admit that Munir's excellent presentation or discussion of this topic here. So Munir, you're doing such a wonderful job describing everything graphically. Makes me want to touch my head and feel it, and know whether or not I actually do have something in front of that line between my ears going anteriorly up in that cranium. But we're going to go ahead and turn it back to M3PQ. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, the Grand Rounds on the Air, a net interactive discussion about the prefrontal lobes today, open to all amateurs. All amateurs can participate. Go back to you, Munir, M3PQ.
Okay, thank you, Jay. This is again Munir M3PQ. So we have newer techniques than our ancestors and forebears had. I remember when I was in medical school back in the 70s, long time ago, I looked for we had primitive techniques compared to today. We had skull x-rays. We had a horrible technique called pneumoencephalography where people would inject air into the spinal. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, into the ventricles of the brain to be able to visualize things better. But that's what we had. And then I remember one day somebody showing me a picture of a CT scan of the head, computerized tomography. It wasn't even a real scan. It was a picture on a glossy paper of one section of the brain. Happened to have been an axial section, I remember it clearly. And it was so low resolution and so unclear, big, huge pixels. And yet we thought, wonder of wonders, we finally have this technique that can show us parts of the brain. So, of course, our newer CT scan of the head techniques are much, much more advanced. It's amazing. And the reason I mention that is because with the development of CT scan of the head, many researchers were able to use the CT scan to localize function to the brain. For example, if they found a lesion in the left hemisphere, by the way, when you look at a CAT scan, left is right and right is left. In the left hemisphere of the brain, especially in one area called Broca's area, you have speech and language difficulty, and etc. And in the back, you can have vision difficulties. So the CT scan was a good technique for trying to, in addition to diagnosing disease, for trying to correlate function with structure of the brain. Even better, wonder of wonders again was the MRI of the brain. And again, when they first started, we had weak magnets. We had 0.3 Tesla magnets, 0.25 Tesla. And nowadays, clinically, in most places, we have stronger magnets, 1.5 Tesla. And for researchers, we have even 7 Tesla, and who knows what's coming next. Again, great detail of the brain, and important in disease, in diagnosing of disease, important in monitoring therapy and the results of therapy, and important in localizing function. And the functional MRI is especially useful. The functional MRI and another technique called PET scan, positron emission tomography, they show the function of the brain or what parts of the brain are active when the subject is performing certain functions. So for example, if they are tapping their fingers up and down, then the motor part of the brain on the opposite side will show uptake of oxygen. But also of note, the sensory part will also show uptake, will also show activity, because you need sensation to be able to do motor function. You cannot have the one without the other. You don't have sensation, you will not have good coordination. Now, what I did not mention, and I don't have a slide on that, is the electrophysiologic investigations of brain function. They are enormously important, whether you talk about surface recordings like the EEG, the electroencephalogram, or depth recordings are very important for localization. And in order to localize function, especially behavior, and we're going to start focusing more on behavior in a minute, you have to have ways to measure behaviors, to quantitate certain behaviors. And for that, we use neuropsychological tests. Of course, I will defer to the neuropsychologists and the group that are much more knowledgeable about these tests than I am. But I'd like to mention a few of great importance. You have the Wisconsin card sorting test, the Stroop color test, sequencing of pictures. You have to put pictures in a certain sequence based on telling a story so that the pictures will have to make logical sense. Trail making, the go, no go test, which I used to use at the bedside, and the 3-step hand posture test of Luria. I'm going to describe one or two of them briefly, but really they are fascinating and worth looking up if you're interested. So the go, no go test, there are standard ways of doing it, but the way I used to do it at the bedside is I would tell the patient, if I tap my finger once, you tap twice. If I tap my finger twice, you tap once. And you do that over and over and over again until the patient got it down pat. Then you say, okay, now if I tap once, you will tap once. If I tap twice, don't tap, don't do anything. Patients with normal patients had no problem with that. Inhibiting the impulse to tap and changing paradigms. Patients with frontal lobe function had great problems with that. Let's say, for example, patients with a certain kind of dementia called frontotemporal dementia, patients with strokes, patients with encephalitis, infections of the brain. The 3-step hand posture test of Luria also is a good test. So for that test, for example, you would show the patient a 3-step hand gesture. First, you kind of put down your closed fist, then you hold the hand on its side, then you hold the hand with the palm open. And the patient has to repeat that sequence. And the patient will repeat after you, but then if you have them do it on their own, they really get flustered if they have frontal lobe problems. Because this change of sequencing, as we'll talk, this change of paradigm, this inhibiting the initial response is difficult for them. So we are getting to the prefrontal lobe in a minute, but to understand that, let's look at other functions that we really know much better than we did many, many decades ago, and even much better than we know behavioral localization. So if you take a line, again, this is very gross, but just for people on the air who are not on Zoom, if you take a line between your two ears and everything in front of that, the very first part in front of that would be the motor cortex, which controls our movement. So basically a stroke on the left side of the brain affecting that cortex or its connections can cause weakness on the right side of the body. Behind that is the sensory cortex. All the way in the back of the brain, in the back of the head, is the visual cortex. And in kind of behind the ear, on top of the ear, and inside the ear, you have the temporal lobe, which has to do with hearing, with memory, with language understanding. And right in front of that, you have Broca's area, which is for language production. And this is an overly simplified schema of the brain, obviously, but just to orient people to where the frontal lobe is, and we'll talk about the prefrontal lobes in a minute. And
Let's go ahead and take a break here for ID for a minute. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta with N3PQ for the Grand Rounds on the Air Net. And we're going to pause here momentarily just for additional check-ins. Now, for those of you in the general amateur community that are listening, we'd like you to also be able to participate. And it's quite helpful to have you check in. I mean, we're open to all amateurs. And actually, we share this information with the general public. That we often will make YouTube videos out of our Zoom recordings. But for the members of the general amateur population that are monitoring today, please go ahead and check in so we can involve you in the roundtable discussion. Make your call to Net Control Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, and we'll get you checked in. Go ahead. Kilo Juliet 5, Papa Bravo Zulu, is that correct? Well, thank you for being here with us today. And in a moment here, we're going to take a list of questions that one might have. Are there any additional stations that would like to check in? Make your call to WB5D. Thank you, everybody, for being here today for this very interesting and important discussion that we're having on 20 meters as well. Are there any questions for Dr. Elawar up to this point? I'll make a list. Make your call to Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta J, Net Control. N4 TSA would like to ask a question. Before we turn the mic over to you, Jerry, are there any other stations that would like to ask questions? Jerry, would you like to come in through the Zoom audio N4 TSC so that Munir perhaps can hear you a little bit better as well as the members on the air here? Turn it over to you. Turn your volume down on your radio. Turn it over to N4 TSC to directly ask questions of N3PQ. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, N3PQ, I'm fascinated by your discussion, and the question comes to mind. Is memory isolated to the temporal portion of the brain, or is it more vast? And what do we know about the function of memory and its transition to poorer function as we get older?
Yes, absolutely, Jerry, absolutely. So yes, so the temporal lobe, of course, is very important in memory, especially if you think about the hippocampus and other parts of the temporal lobe and the limbic system. But let's say, let me give you an example, because I think that might help us answer the question in this way. Let's say I know a certain person, John Smith. So I know what he looks like. And part of that is in my visual cortex and the association areas. I know what he sounds like. And part of that is in my temporal lobe and my auditory areas. I know how he talks, and I know how he walks even. Sometimes you can tell, you can remember a person or recognize a person by just the way they walk or their gait. So it's definitely in that sense distributed. So I think that what happens, at least that's what we think, is that there are various portions of memory related to a certain subject, a certain object or subject, parts of which are, if you want to use a word for lack of a better term, stored in different parts of the brain. And then you bring them all together. And then you remember, okay, I saw John Smith yesterday at the restaurant at such and such a time. So you have to bring all of these things together. And that's where the prefrontal lobe, I think, partly comes in, because it's like the CEO of the rest of the brain. It brings everything together. But I don't think it's only in one area. Obviously, as many of you know, the working memory, what we hold in temporary memory to solve a problem or to answer a question or to remember a phone number or to do a math problem, that is very, very, there's a great importance for the temporal lobe in that, in working memory and the hippocampus. But not only that, the prefrontal lobe is important in that, and then it gets consolidated in various parts of the brain, such as the hippocampus and other parts of the brain. So the brief answer to your question, I think memory is not just remembering one thing. It's remembering several things about one thing, so we can bring it to mind. And these several things are gathered from different parts of the brain, controlled by the prefrontal lobe, to say, okay, this is John Smith. I remember seeing him yesterday at such and such a time. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my understanding of the subject.
I would concur with the observation that as I get older, my memory is becoming more difficult to recall things quickly. But then by association, I'm able to retrieve the information. And I think that that kind of adds credence to what you've just explained. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, association is so important. So yes, you do associate somebody's face with their name, with their voice, with how they walk, et cetera, et cetera. It's all, everything I think is to do with association. That's why we don't have a chance to talk about the association cortices of the brain, but that's what brings everything together, like the visual cortex. Plus,
may I comment?
yes, please.
Also need to make a distinction between the storage areas and the indexing system. The hippocampus is the indexing system, and quite often the information is still there, but something happens to the index. It gets scrambled. We do that when we do ECT. People will have brief periods of confusion and memory loss, but it comes back. And the fact that it comes back means that it never left. It was always there. But the indexing system has to reboot and put all the pieces back together again, so you can find those things that are scattered all over your brain.
Yes, yes, thank you. That's very helpful. I really appreciate that. And I like the word reboot, by the way. I mean, sometimes we tend to compare our brain function to computers, but that's, yes. May I ask a quick question, Jay? Because are we still using a lot of ECT nowadays?
Okay, I'm going to let, we're going to go ahead and continue this conversation. This is AA4FL, my personal call for Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. Grand rounds in the internet, and our presentation today, our discussion topic today, is being led by N3PQ Munir, and I believe we had N5RTF here that was having a little discussion. Why don't you guys go ahead and continue on your thread of the questions about this particular topic. Go ahead and answer that. Chip, N5RTF.
Yeah, I was a psychiatrist, just retired a year ago, but over the course of my career, I did about 9,000 ECT treatments. It's still the best treatment for depression. Specific, it's used for treatment-resistant depression, things that don't respond to psychotherapy and medications, and it's still about twice as good as anything else. So it is an effective treatment, but it does have effects on memory as well, and you can observe them because they are very predictable. The memory will gradually come back over the course of about a day. We never let a patient drive home for that reason, but by the next day they were able to get up and go to work and not have anything detectable going on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question, and Jerry, I don't know if you observe this too, N4-TSC, being an ophthalmologist. So I think, Munir, the way N3PQ you described, the visual cortex is in the back of the brain. So with the eyes in the front, do you think there's some evolutionary reason why it would be so far from the source of the vision? Over.
Wow, that's a fantastic question. I must admit I haven't given it any thought, so I don't really know the answer to that. But it's certainly something I might want to research and look at, unless somebody else has an answer to that. I haven't given the thought. I have given thought to other evolutionary connections to the brain. Like, for example, why is the left hemisphere controlling the right side of the body and vice versa as far as motion is concerned, but not with regards to the visual cortex, no.
Okay, thank you for having that discussion with me. Something for amateur radio operators that's interesting in all this discussion here with N4-TSC talking about association and also the rebooting correlation here from N5-RTF chip. All excellent comments. But the Association for Amateur Radio Operators, we don't necessarily, as we talk on the radio, have the visuals. So as we have this association, perhaps there's some extension of amateur radio that we associate with a particular individual. For example, you talk to somebody in a DX country, maybe it was their accent and their voice, or maybe it was some trip that you had taken that you associate with. So for all the general amateur population that's listening today that aren't in a health-related field, just think about that and being able to remember conversations that you have with other hands. Think of other ways to correlate that. I know it was always very difficult for me as a dentist when I had patients laying down and trying to remember everybody's name when you'd run into them in public and whether or not you really, recognize them. And these associations are just so important. But there's times when you can also stimulate the oral conversation back by just making a general comment like, oh, it's so nice to see you. And then the associations start to flow back. So I don't know, Jerry talked about getting older, if that's something you and I share together, because we are both getting older, and for TSC. Did you want to make any comment, Jerry, additionally about the visual cortex being in the back of the brain and for TSC, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta?
Well, yeah, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta and 4-TSC. The only thing that I would observe is that in the development from the embryo, as the brain develops, you can see how the stalk develops anteriorly and then moves back to the back of the brain. And a phrase comes to mind that is ontology recapitulates phylogeny, and you see the same kind of development from all the species that you look at. And maybe from an evolutionary point of view, early on, the function of being able to see is probably a primary function, and then as the other elements develop, they get sort of pushed to the back, to the visual cortex, and the sensory area in the front gets pushed in the front, and then you get development that way. The other observation that I would make about memory is that I've always had difficulty remembering names. from the time that I started to be aware of it, I was by 12, 13 years old. I was aware of it, difficulty remembering names. And now as I get older, I find that that's the first thing that's starting to go, is that I can't recall the names of certain people that I've dealt with through the course of my life. And so I think possibly what's happening as we get older is that the vascularization and the ability to be able to feed those areas of the brain start to be compromised by our vascularity, and that may mean that there's a slow fading of these various different areas. And I noticed that when we talked about indexing, yeah, that memory is probably still there, because sometimes when people get into conversations with me, we talk about a particular thing, and by selective memory, instantaneously, I remember details of things that I haven't thought about for 30, 40, 50 years. So I think maybe that's another observation that we can make about the functioning of the brain.
Thank you, Jerry, and not to monopolize the conversation here, I want to turn this back.
One other comment, if I may. I have prosopagnosia. I've had it all my life. It's not a brain injury. It just never, my ability to recognize faces never developed. And so faces are pretty useless to me. I can recognize people by the way they walk, by the way they dress, and specifically their voices. I will never call anybody by name until they speak, because I recognize people by their voices. So that whole area of my brain just doesn't work, and I have to tell people that in advance. If I'm getting to know somebody, I just warn them that I'll walk right past them and not recognize them. So I just learned to live with it. But there's lots of people walking around, with specific deficits that you might not be aware of because they've learned to cover for it really well in 5RTF.
Okay, thank you, Chip. And momentarily here, we're going to talk about behavior and personality. Munir is going to bring this up, N3PQ, and continue the discussion. One additional comment from me, because we're talking about all these different happenings that are going on in the way we're processing, and also development. But if we're looking at the across species as time goes on, just an aside, well, as amateur radio operators, many of us are very technical. We look at the world in different ways, and that most people ask questions. And a lot of us are really knowledgeable about computing. Now, I'm not familiar with quantum computing. I know Harry, WB9EDP, that's with us today, is, but we think about supercomputers, and we think about artificial intelligence, and we start looking at MRIs between species at all these different findings are crunched by quantum computers, and in combination with AI. I wonder what we'll actually find, and that means I'm also referring to the MRIs and looking at the different activities, if they can also compare that across species and across people like Chip, who have a particular deficit. So I'm gonna, with that being said, before we turn it back to our speaker, are there any additional check-ins to the Medical Amateur Radio Council brand rounds of the internet? Make a call, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. Well, I tell you, we certainly are having wonderful discussions today. This is the way a roundtable net should be had on 20 meters, should be held. So we appreciate everyone being so participatory today. Let's give N3PQ a chance to also talk about some more discussion threads within the subject that we're bringing up. Go ahead, Munir.
Thank you, Jay. This is Munir N3PQ. So finally, what about behavior and personality? Like I said, I always like to give a historical perspective and a general view, and then we'll drill down to actual behavior and personality. This brings us to a certain gentleman called Phineas Gage, very famous in medical history. Phineas Gage lived in 19th century Vermont. He was a capable railroad gang foreman, very respectable, very good worker. In 1848, he had an injury in which an explosion drove a large stamping iron, about 3.5 feet long and about 13 pounds heavy, into his frontal lobes. What happened is he was trying to clear rocks to level the ground. This involved drilling a hole in the rock, filling it with gunpowder, setting a fuse, and adding sand on top. Now, on a fateful day, he apparently forgot to add the sand. So when he tamped down the powder, the iron rod hit the side of the rock, caused a spark, and ignited the powder. So this big tamping iron rod went through the left cheekbone and out the top of the skull. It went through his left orbit. It landed almost 82 feet behind him, so this was quite an explosion. He was initially barely conscious, but amazingly, he eventually recovered and regained strength. His personality, however, showed a marked change. He was said to be no longer Gage, no longer the same person. He became irreverent, dissipated, irresponsible, and vacillating, to use the words of Dr. Harlow. And this is a mistyping here. This is not Marlowe, it should be Harlow. I'm going to read this paragraph because it's worth reading. It's a beautiful language and very clear language. He described him as such. The description was in 1868. The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between the intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others, appearing more feasible. A child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, he has the animal passions of a strong man. I like the way they used to describe things. It's very clear. Now, needless to mind you, Phineas Gage did go on to work, and he did have some productive jobs. And at one time, I could be wrong about this, don't quote me on that, I think he even joined the circus and was like a sideshow or something of that nature. But he did have all these personality changes. So since then, there have been many more patients with brain injuries, with brain infections, with strokes, and they have been studied at length. So we have to look now more carefully at the prefrontal lobes. And the prefrontal lobes, like I described, are the very frontal part of the brain. And we like to divide them in three ways, into three regions. What we call the dorsolateral is basically the upper and the outer side. What we call the orbitofrontal is right on top of the eyeballs and behind the eyeballs. And the medial is in the middle of the head. So if you imagine a line from the nose all the way to the back of the head, split it in half, that's the medial side of the brain. So with a lot of research and functional MRIs and CT scans and all other kinds of research, what's transpiring is that this area, as we said, is very, very important in personality and behavior. So damage to the dorsolateral part of the frontal lobes affects problem solving, poor sequencing, lack of self-monitoring for errors and self-correction and perseveration. There's also reduced working memory, poor memory for temporal sequence of events, what happened before what, poor retrieval strategies with intact recognition. Damage to the medial frontal lobe can cause apathy, social disengagement, indifference, lack of initiative, and emotional underreactivity. Damage to the orbitofrontal, the part of the frontal lobes on top of the orbits, on top of the eyes. Those people have disinhibition, poor social skills, hyperactivity, and emotional overreactivity. So obviously very, very important. And one of the reasons it's the frontal lobes, the prefrontal lobes especially, are important in behavior and emotion is that they have extensive interconnections with the limbic system. which is involved in regulating emotions, memory, and behavior. For example, the amygdala, which is a structure in the limbic system that looks like an almond, has a lot of interconnectivity with other parts of the brain, and this seems to be especially important in fear. So this connectivity, rich connections between the frontal lobes and the limbic system obviously has a huge bearing on behavior and emotion and control of behavior and emotion. So now, with all the research about frontal lobe and frontal lobe function, and especially the prefrontal lobes, there was a development of frontal lobotomies or leucotomies. Lobotomies is where they remove part of the prefrontal lobe. They just remove it. Leucotomy is where they undercut the white matter, the connection between the prefrontal lobe and the rest of the brain. So Igas Monitz, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, in 1936, started performing prefrontal lobotomies on psychotic patients. Prefrontal lobotomies and leucotomies became popular in the 1940s, and later they were used for schizophrenia, anxious depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, chronic pain syndrome. I'm not quite clear exactly how they studied all of these things and the effect of prefrontal leucotomy on that, but it was used for that. Now, supposedly, those patients had some improvement, supposedly, reportedly. The price, however, was too high. They had indifference to the feelings of others, social ineptness, distractibility, euphoria, emotional outbursts. Some patients became very apathetic. This procedure, needless to say, is no longer done, at least not in the US, to my knowledge. So I'm gonna I'm gonna summarize what we've talked about prefrontal lobe and what we call executive functions. Think about it as acting like the CEO of the brain. In the orbitofrontal, when there is a deficit, it's disinhibition. These people will, let's say, urinate in public, will say things that are very inappropriate. Poor social skills, impulsivity, hyperactivity, emotional overreactivity. The dorsolateral frontal, they have impaired problem solving. They are concrete in their thinking, no abstract thinking. They have environmental dependency. If you extend the hand to them and say, for example, don't shake my hand, they still nonetheless want to shake your hand. They also have what we call release signs. If you stroke the palm of the hand, they want to grasp the palm of the hand. And the theory is that they revert to some infantile behavior, like sucking behavior, rooting behavior, grasping behavior. They have perseveration. They almost get stuck on the same idea, almost like an old vinyl record stuck on the groove. Poor sequencing, lack of self-monitoring for errors and self-correction, impaired memory with reduced working memory, poor memory for temporal sequence of events, poor retrieval strategies, but they have intact recognition. The medial frontal, they have apathy, akinetic mutism, don't talk, don't move. They have leg weakness. They might also have, by the way, urine incontinence, depends on where the lesion is, because the lesions are not very precise, mind you. Whenever somebody has a stroke or a tumor or an infection, it doesn't hit specific areas only. It might hit that area plus adjoining areas. Apathy, they are socially disengaged, indifference, lack of initiation, emotionally underreactive with intermittent dysregulation. So in brief, the prefrontal cortex is involved in a wide range of higher order functions, and we're still studying that and still trying to understand what these functions mean. I mean, they're obviously very, very important to our functioning as human beings. They are called executive functions, and they include planning, decision-making, working memory, and social behavior. Again, these are very general terms with lots of subdivisions. Through its role in cognitive control, it allows for goal-directed behavior, and inhibits inappropriate action. So somebody called Halstead and also a Russian psychologist called Luria, they call the prefrontal lobes or the frontal lobes the organ of civilization. And I tend to agree with them. I also tend to agree a lot with John Milton. He said something in Paradise Lost. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. I do have some sources for you for people who are interested. I'm going to go over them very briefly. The first one is a standard textbook of neurology that just about everybody uses in medical school and neurology training. The second one is a beautiful, beautiful neuroscience book by Kandel, used to be Kandel and Schwartz, but now it's Kandel and others, called Principles of Neural Science. There is the Einstein Medical School has on a website a very nice chapter about the frontal lobes, which is also published in print under the title, The Little Black Book of Neuropsychology. It's actually a fun book to read. And two references or two sources that are not directly related to our subject. But one of them is called The Mechanism of Mind, which I read in college, Edward de Bono. It's amazing. And this was 1969, by the way, it was published. It's amazing how much of it is still relevant. And the little gem of a book by Thomas Nagel called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? I think he means, what is it like to be in the mind of a bat? He doesn't really come to any definite conclusions, but it's the discussion about, I think it's the discussion about, can we create a computer that thinks like a human, acts like a human, and becomes a human, or is there something special about us humans? That no matter how advanced our AI becomes, it can never be like a human, basically, like a human. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Yeah, this is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta Net Control. We'll make a list here for questions. Go ahead on 20 meters, make your call to Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta with any questions, and we'll add them to the list. Is there anyone else that would like to ask questions? Go ahead and let me know. We'll make a list. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. Okay, were there any late check-ins? Make your call to WB5D. Well, Munir, thank you very much. N3PQ, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, AA4F Alpha Mike. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. There's certainly a lot of food for thought here as we start to assimilate. For those of you that have come on 20 meters during different times here today, during our interactive discussion and question and answers, that maybe didn't get a chance to hear the entire. This has been recorded on a SDR, remote SDR, by N5 RTF. And Chip's recordings, the web stream that was live is recorded, will be available later today on marcoaudio.net. That's Marco, like M-A-R-C-O, audio, one word, .net. So please feel free to use that for the audio. In addition, we will be making available a recording of the Zoom session, hopefully as a YouTube video, probably later this evening. If you'd like that information, like the link to that, go ahead and send me an email using my QRZ address. You can either do it through the Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta website, or for purposes of emailing me, Alpha 4 Foxtrot Lima, AA4FL, J in Hawthorne, Florida. Just look this up. And once again, Munir, thank you very much for the wonderful discussion today on 20 meters. We look forward to having your participation as a member on the recipient end rather than the provider end. But also, of course, we're with such an excellent discussion points today, and the way that you presented them so descriptively to the 20-meter participants. We encourage you to consider further discussions in the future dates. Always looking for excellent subject material, excellent participation, and excellence in the people that provide this material. We do realize that anything we do from the Medical Amateur Radio Council to the group here, it's not medical advice. It's just discussions amongst ham radio operators that have a common interest, just like many 20-meter nets. We get together on nets to discuss our passions that tie our hobby to our individual interests. Amateur radio, in our particular case, is health-related subjects. So do not consider it medical advice, but it's a good starting point to ask questions. And you do have your own medical team as we talk about the brain and the way the brain functions. Certainly, if you notice something going different. Now, I'm going to turn it back to additional comments from M3BQ. Munir, go ahead.
Yes, I based on the questions that were asked and based on seeing some gray hairs on the video screens and our ages, perhaps without giving any specific medical advice, in the future we can have something on how strategies to improve memory as we age, or to improve our, I don't know, our functioning. I'm sure there are things we can discuss that are not directed medical advice. Starting with the Greek aphorism, you know, a sound mind and a sound body, perhaps, but many other things that are legitimately good, short of, you know, talking about medications and treatments and things of that nature.
Wonderful idea. You know, we're always looking for different holidays or ham radio events to tie this into. Jerry, maybe this is one for us to have for Grandparents' Day and for TSC. So I know he and I, as grandparents of grandchildren around the same age, we certainly use everything we can to improve our memories. Jerry, do you have any comments?
Well, I think that the comment that I should make is that the general rule of thumb is that you have to be involved and physically to keep your physical health functioning, but that ties into your mental health, and you have to continue to challenge yourself mentally. And I will send you a little short video of the interaction that I just had with my grandchildren later on today, Jay. And also, I would just say that you just have to keep involved. And the latest is that I am trying to transition from using an iPhone 7 to jumping to an iPhone 16. And I'm trying to learn the different gests. And so far, I haven't yet quite mastered some of the gests to get this phone to work. But I'm told that one day I will get there.
Thank you for taking that adventure of moving up, you know, almost a dozen models and iPhones. I got a question, Munir, and actually for Jerry too, because Jerry had brought up before circulation, and you know, perhaps a part of the aging that maybe the vasculature in the brain was changing. Munir, perhaps this is a subject for another day as well. What is the discussion these days about amyloid plaques in the brain? N3PQ, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta.
Well, that's a very, very wonderful question. It's very topical. I say, well, amyloid plaque and tau proteins are very, very important in Alzheimer's disease. And the amyloid plaque theory is not necessarily new, but now they are coming up with new medications that can help with that without causing too many undue side effects. The first medications that came on the market and I became familiar with, I never used them. I wasn't convinced. Even though the FDA approved them, I did not use them. They had some tremendous side effects. And I think the benefit was really marginal initially. But it's at least they opened the door to further research on amyloid plaques and tau proteins. As we all know, there's a strong genetic component, some genetic component. We don't know the details of that fully yet. We just know there is a genetic component. So I always tell people, choose your parents very wisely if you don't want to develop dementia. But it goes in many other things. But yeah, the research, I think finally, I mean, every once in a while we get some really magnificent almost paradigm shift in medicine, in treatment, like the GLP-1 medications for diabetes and obesity have really been paradigm changing. So maybe eventually we're going to have something for Alzheimer's disease. My suspicion is that the amyloid plaque and the tau proteins do not tell the whole story of Alzheimer's disease. There's something more to it than that, whether it be programmed cell death or I don't know. I mean, I'm like going on a limb here, discussing things that people are doing research on. So I think time will tell. I think we're still in the early stages, but at least some brave souls are trying to tackle this problem of amyloid plaques and tau protein. And the other thing is synuclein is another important thing in the brain that's to do with degenerative diseases.
Thank you, N3PQ, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. So as one can tell for all of you that are listening, and we're going to bring the net to a close and return the frequency momentarily here. We'll close it and return it to the general amateur population. We appreciate everyone allowing us the time to have our net. And I know here we're getting a little more technical, and these are subjects for another day. But if you would like to be involved in the Medical Amateur Radio Council, feel free to check out our websites and just Google the Medical Amateur Radio Council. It's marco-ltd.org, but to simplify things, just use healthcarehams.org. Healthcarehams.org is easy to remember. There's a subscription for you. Okay, go ahead. We have Debbie.
Hi, I
Debbie,
actually just have a question for Gerald Zipperstein. I noticed a statue behind you. Did you happen to get that at Mount Sinai?
Okay, what statue are you talking about?
Is there one over your other shoulder?
Uh,
Is that a little statue back there on the desk
in the white coat.
in the white coat?
in the white.
The figurine.
Oh, that. Yeah, there's a figurine of an ophthalmologist who is holding a card, a visual card.
Did you get that at Mount Sinai?
No, that was given to me as a gift.
Okay.
So I don't know what its origin is.
Okay. My father sold them. My father ran the bookstore at Mount Sinai, I think when you were there. And I just looked you up to see what the timing was. And he sold those when he was there. He ran the bookstore for quite a few years. And I have one too, which is why it caught my eye. So I have a female obstetrician holding out a baby, like how doctors used to catch.
Oh yes, I have something else that might be of interest to you that's similar, but I don't see it at hand now. But it was actually made by Jimmy Cagney.
Oh wow! All right.
Who started to make these kinds of things after he retired from acting.
Oh my gosh, that's fabulous. All right, just thought there might be that connection. Thank you, everybody. The talk was really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Munir, from all of us and W1HMM. So HMM, I'll get it right, Harry, eventually, but I've got you logged in correctly. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta AA4FL net control. We're going to bring the net to a close and return the frequency to general amateur use. Thank you once again, Munir and 3PQ.
Thank you.
This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta saying 7-3 to all, and next week there'll be no net because of the CQ worldwide.